today we're going to address small RNAs. They have been neglected for many years, but it has become increasingly evident that they play a giant role in regulating gene expression. We have in our cells, especially in the eukaryotic cells, there are lots of different small RNAs that is controlling and regulating cell physiology. The way, but RNA can also regulate not only small RNAs, but also messenger RNAs sometimes have a regulatory function. And that is done primarily by taking different secondary structures, as we will see later. I mean, if you have read the text of today, you will see that lots of different names for RNAs. It's extremely confusing. Don't try to learn them all by heart. There are, however, some that is need to know, and that is the classical ones: messenger RNA, tRNA, rRNAs, then we have the other ones that is the small RNAs. And here we have this confusion about nomenclature. But the thing is, don't try to remember them all by heart. But when you see the names, you should know what it is, if that makes any sense or anti-sense. Okay, as I just said, there's a huge number of RNAs, small RNAs in the eukaryotic cells, and it appears that most of the genome is actually transcribed on both strands. So, first of all, RNA is considered a single-stranded. It's normally considered single-stranded, apart from some viruses that has double-stranded RNA. You'll hear much more about RNAs in the next lecture. But just RNA, is that actually single-stranded? If you have a strand like this, yeah, it's a single-stranded RNA, but it's not in that conformation. Instead, it folded into a secondary structure with base pairing. If you look at this, is there any surprises if you just look at the base pairings there? Well, one of the surprises may be for some of you that you have GU base pairing. And the thing is about these UG base pairs is that do not contribute to the stability, but it is not preventing the formation of this secondary structure. Another thing is that these double-stranded RNAs, they must come with a loop somehow, because it's the same strand, so they have loops at the tops, and there have to be at least 3 nucleotides in the loop. There can't be much more, but at least 3. Otherwise, they can't form. Another thing that you often observe is that it's allowed to have bulges in the double-stranded structure, like this. So how do you identify? There's lots of different RNA folding servers out on the internet. So if you want to check your favorite RNA sequence, don't hesitate to visit one of these pages and fold your favorite RNA strand. If you take the one that I have just shown as an example, it will come back with that. And there are some parameters. This is you can see it's the delta G value. This is calculated at 37 degrees Celsius. Another thing that's worthwhile to note is that anything that has a negative delta G value, there's a high probability that it will form, because That's physical chemistry, I mean. So it's a good way to see, does this structure make sense or not? And then you simply you can calculate the delta G value for that. And you can use the servers for that. Okay, now these strands can also be, or these structures can also be found by using URIs and simply do it by looking at the sequence and see, can I see inverted repeats? And if you can identify an inverted repeat, not necessarily perfect, but to some extent, then it's then the RNA will fold into a secondary structure. We have stumbled upon these inverted repeats before. You may remember it, but often what they characterize is the binding site for a protein. You may remember that it's not a huge area. It could be down to 5 inverted repeat of 5 + 5 nucleotides. Okay, so RNA can fold into the secondary structure. If you have a structure like this, you can of course fold into a structure like this. But if you then extend it a little bit with this purple ones, this DNA strand can actually fold into 2 different structures. In one structure, you have base pairing between A and B, and in the other situation, you have base pairing between B and C. Now, these structures are mutually exclusive, meaning that you cannot form these 2 structures at the same time. Either you form one or the other. So you can say that the formation of one structure prevents the formation of another. So if you have one conformation, you cannot have a second conformation at the same time. You can, either of these exist, but not both of them at the same time. Right? Good. One of these structures will probably be more stable. So the probability that one structure is formed is higher than the other one, and we'll come back to that in a moment. I don't know. I think I think this one would be the most stable. This appears extremely unstable. This structure here. Okay, let's make a small detour to termination, to intrinsic terminators. Because if you remember how termination functions in prokaryotes, you have these, they are coded by a RNA that folds into a stem loop structure followed by a stretch of U residues. So, and the important thing is to note that the use has to be immediately after the stem loop structure. Then you have what is called an intrinsic terminator. You can also identify terminators in the DNA, because then you will have an inverted repeat, and then also a number of T's on the strand. Okay, so how has nature exploited the formation of secondary structures in the RNA? For that, I will take a small detour to my favorite topic, that is nucleotide metabolism in Lactococcus lactis. I see in the previous lecture, someone was talking about purine biosynthesis or purine metabolism. I see here. But now let's take a quick look on pyrimidine biosynthesis. And the example here that I mentioned is from Lactococcus lactis. Lactococcus lactis, that's the bacterium that's used in cheese production. So when you eat cheese, you eat Lactococcus lactis. Now, they, as all other organisms, needs RNA and DNA to grow, and they are obtained from, and these are produced from nucleotides, ATP, GTP, and so forth. Now these precursors, these nucleotides, they are of course synthesized within the cell. It can either be by biosynthesis or by utilization of exogenous sources. So you can take it up and use it. If you look at the pyrimidines, here you can see that we have the CTP, UTP here, and the TTP over here. And the deoxy-CTP here. So that's for DNA. The ribonucleotides are for RNA. Any case, in any way, the biosynthesis looks like this. You start with carbon dioxide, and through a number of different steps, you get UTP. Now these, the enzymes is encoded by a number of different genes. Here in total, we have them here. The different genes are organized in small operons. And one of the genes in that operon was a little bit, I wouldn't say surprising, but we could identify what we termed that looked like a regulatory gene. So we have all the structural genes, but also on top of that, a regulatory gene. So what was the role of this? So when you have a question, get a mutant, right? So a mutant was obtained in this gene and analyzed. So and that was done by transposer mutagenesis. Some of you have tried that in the lab, in the lab course. But in a similar experiment, a PR mutant was obtained. And then it was simply a matter of just measuring the enzymatic activities of the different enzymes encoded by the pyrimidine biosynthetic genes. And it gave something like this. We have them in the wild type situation. We measured the activity in a strain that was growing in the absence and presence of uracil. Now the reason for that is, you can see here, uracil is there. So if the cell is supplied with uracil, it will be taken up and converted into UTP. And when that is present, there's no need for a biosynthetic pathway. So that is repressed in the presence of uracil. And that's what you see here. You have a twofold repression by uracil. Not much, but significant. Now, how did the mutant then behave? Well, you can see here that there was no difference in the absence of presence of uracil. So, but we have what we say is constitutive high levels. There's one exception, and that was this PureDA mutant. That's another gene. That is another story. We can take that at another time. So, based on these results here, would you say that PR is a repressor or an activator? If you have a mutant with a deletion in PR, it has increased levels of pyrimidine gene expression. So you would immediately suggest that it is what? We have this rule of thumb. In a repressor system, loss of function mutation will lead to constitutively high expressions. Operator mutant would also lead to constitutively high expressions. If you had an activator system, it will lead to constitutively low expression in both the mutation in the regulatory gene, but also in the activator binding site. So in this case, it's pretty obvious that PR is a repressor. Right. Okay, so how is it working? How is this? Immediately, one would think, we could look for a repressor binding site. We could see that that it could bind and prevent the RNA polymerase from getting access to the promoter. That was the role of PR. But that wasn't the case. The transcription initiation was not affected in any way by the presence and absence of PR. So it would be something else. We know that it regulates all the genes except this one. But another thing that we observed is that it can fold the leader into two mutually exclusive structures. So we can do something like this. We can find in front of each gene, we can identify these structures. And this is how they look. They can fold into such a nice structure here, or they can fold into something like this. So what's the difference? Yeah, you should say that the sequences are not conserved. You couldn't say that that this part that the nucleotide sequence of this CARB was very similar to pure EC. So it's, but they could fold into something similar structure-wise. There was, however, one part of the RNA that was conserved in all the different leaders. So if you look at one of them, for instance, this pure EC, we have two structures, one like this and another one like this. Now, if you calculate the delta G values of these two, it's not there, but trust me when I tell you that this one has a lower delta G value. So this structure will be the one that will form if there's nothing else into the system. So this is the this is the most favorable structure, and it is what we call the anti-terminator. And why we did so, it will be evident in a second. So what could make it shift? What could stabilize the least stable structure? Here the pure R protein comes into play, because the thing is that pure R comes in two different conformations. In one conformation that is inactive, and then a conformation where it's active. But in order to form an active conformation, it has to bind UMP. And UMP is actually the end product of the pathway or the genes that it's regulating. So what is happening? Well, the active form of PR can bind to this structure here and stabilize it. So that's why it was termed the anti-terminator, because the formation of this terminator will prevent the formation of the anti-terminator. And if the anti-terminator is prevented from forming, then it will form the terminator. Okay. So the role of PR is to bind to the anti-terminator and stabilizing this conformation, but only at high UMP concentrations. So what is going on? So how this is a model that then can explain what's going on. Okay, so if we have a situation, we have a promoter and it is constitutive. The promoter is firing with the same frequency. So we have a constant production of RNA. Now, in a situation where the concentration of UMP is low, pure R will be in the conformation where it cannot bind the RNA. So what will happen here is that the anti-terminator will form because this is the most stable one. And so the transcription will continue and you will express the structural genes. And that is done when the UMP concentration is low. And that makes perfect sense, because when UMP concentration is low, the organism needs to produce UMP, so it needs to express the biosynthetic genes. Okay. If the concentration of UMP is high, then the PR will be in its RNA binding conformation. And when it does so, it will stabilize the anti-terminator, and that will prevent formation of the anti-terminator and favor the formation of the terminator. So here we will have termination of transcription before the structural genes are expressed. Again, it makes sense. If there's plenty of UMP, there's no need for expressing the biosynthetic genes. So let's proceed with another example of what is called an attenuator. How RNA folding can regulate gene expression. And this is the classical one, the TRIP attenuator from E. coli. Now I'll say that if you truly understand how the TRIP attenuator works, then you know everything. So if you have a complete idea of this and can go into each and every detail about this system and understand it, then you understand all about molecular biology. Almost. No, the thing is, the reason why I say this, because it involves both transcription and translation at the same time, and these are how these are intertwined. So that's why it's so good. Now, if we start from the beginning with the TRIP operon for E. coli, now you have regulation of this. This is the pathway also at the enzymatic level. So if you have tryptophan present in high concentrations, it will inhibit the first step in the enzymatic, the first enzyme by an allosteric repression. Now, if you look at the genes encoding the different enzymes, they are found in one operon. So you have all the structural genes expressed from one messenger RNA. If you take a closer look at the promoter region, now what we know here is that the TRIP operon is negatively controlled by tryptophan, and that is by a repressor, the TRIP repressor. I mentioned that when we were talking about prokaryotic gene regulation, lecture 9. That where we went through this. But just briefly, what we have is that you have the operon. Then we have a TRIP-R, the regulator. The most stable one, that is the inactive TRIP-R. That is the protein, a protein that cannot bind to DNA. So when that is so what's happening here is the promoter is available for the RNA polymerase that then can transcribe the genes, produce a messenger RNA, and make all the enzymes. And then we have tryptophan biosynthesis. Now, if you have a situation where we have tryptophan in the medium, it's taken up by a cell, and then it stabilizes the least stable conformation, and that is the one that binds DNA. So in this case, tryptophan is a co-repressor. So this complex then binds to the promoter and prevents the RNA polymerase from binding to the promoter. So there's no low expression. That was the classical repressor system that we discussed 2 weeks ago. Now on top of that, the TRIP operon is also controlled by attenuation. So just as we saw with the pyrimidine operon, we have a situation where the RNA can fold into a terminator before the structural genes are transcribed. So what these the attenuators, they have an intrinsic terminator in the leader region. Actually, we saw that the pyrimidine biosynthesis it's not very dramatic. It's only a twofold regulation, but in this with the TRIP system, it's actually 1,000 times regulated by tryptophan availability. So what is special about the trip operon is that the leader produces a small protein. Now, normally, how we define a leader, that is the first part of the messenger RNA that does not encode a protein. That is called the leader. So the leader is a piece of RNA. So you can say that the leader includes the Chian-Delgado sequence. Now, the special thing about the trip operon is that it has an open breeding frame in the leader. It codes a protein of 14 amino acids, very small, but it includes, the mic is going down the drain now. So it codes this small protein, but it has 2 tryptophans in the protein. And what we will see in a second is that which conformation that is favored in this leader, in the attenuator, that is defined by the speed of translation. And we will see that if you have plenty of tryptophan, and that would also mean that you have plenty of tryptophan tRNAs that is loaded, it will form a hairpin that causes termination. And the opposite happens in the absence of tryptophan or low concentration, then you will form an anti-terminator. So how is it actually working? That's working, but how does it look in a cartoon like this? So we have the trip leader, attenuator, and what happens is that the RNA polymerase is transcribing the leader. So the RNA polymerase just moves along. So what is on this leader? Yes, we can find 4 different sequences. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, 2 and 3 can base pair and form a structure, but 1 and 2 can base pair, and 3 and 4 can base pair. So you have these 2 mutually exclusive structures. Either one structure is formed, or the other one is formed. If we form the one with the 2 hairpins, then we'll also form a terminator, because we have a stem loop followed by a stretch of uracil residues. So that means that this is the terminator structure. If we form the alternative is when 2 and 3 base pair, then we will form the anti-terminator. And it is quite evident that only one of them can form. And of course, one of them will be preferred, and the preferred one, that is the terminator structure, because it simply has more base pairing. And the more base pairing you have, the more stable a structure you will form, the lower the delta G value will be. So if nothing goes into it, then we will form the terminator at all times. Now, if we look at this once again, what you see here is the four different sequences that constitute the 2 stem loop structures. But here they are. But on top of that, we have the leader peptide. So it starts with this AUD start codon here. We have Bourmelon number of codons, including 2 tryptophans right after each other, and then we have a stop codon. You can see over here, you have some G's and A's, so that they will constitute a Chian-Delgado sequence. Feinschmeckers will realize that this is not a very good Chian-Delgado sequence. But it's okay, but one of the consequences of having a not so good Chian-Delgado sequence is that the initiation frequency of translation is low. And that is important. You may realize that at some point, perhaps later today. Okay, so this is how it looks in another way. You have the leader with the 4 inverted, or the 4 repeats, and then you have the leader peptide, the open reading frame here, and including the tryptophan codes. Now, what happens if the tryptophan concentration is low? Well, we have the RNA polymerase that starts from the promoter and transcribes the leader, starts transcribing the leader sequence. Now, if tryptophan concentration is low, the ribosome that will initiate transcription right after start, because as you should know, is that in prokaryotes, the transcription and translation is coupled. So as soon as you have a Shine-Dalgarno sequence and a start codon, then you have a ribosome that can start translating. And that's what's happening here. But if tryptophan concentration is low, then the ribosome becomes stalled at this position, because it's waiting for a tryptophan-loaded tRNA to deliver the tryptophan into the ribosome. And the tryptophan concentration is low, so this is a rate-limiting step here. So it needs tryptophan or rather tryptophan loaded to tRNA to continue translation. So the ribosome is stalled. And when that happens, when the ribosome is stalled here, what it does is that it masks, it blocks the first repeat in the first stem loop structure. So the first stem is blocked, and when the first stem is blocked, then it cannot form a base pair with the second stem. But instead, stem 2 and 3 can actually can then form a structure. And this is the structure that's the anti-terminator structure, because if this structure is formed, then number 3 and number 4 cannot base pair, because number 3 is occupied in base pairing with repeat 2. So in this case, that's why in this case, transcription will proceed into the structural genes and express or produce the enzymes needed for tryptophan biosynthesis. So that happens when tryptophan is low, and that makes good sense, because if tryptophan is low, it's because the cells needs to produce more tryptophan. So make complete sense. Okay. And then we have the ribosomes available for translating the structural genes as just discussed. Okay, let's take the other situation. Tryptophan concentration is high and microphone is low. You haven't got a chance to fall asleep here. Yeah. If I had something for my hair, I could put in here, but I haven't. So tryptophan concentration is high. What happens then? Okay, then as before, the RNA polymerase starts transcribing, and because there's plenty of tryptophan, the ribosome will finish translating and dissociate from the RNA. And then 1 and 2 can base pair because they are available. And consequently, 2 and 3 cannot base pair, but 3 and 4 can base pair and form the terminator. And transcription is terminated before the RNA polymerase reaches the structural genes. So this makes good sense. If you have a high concentration of tryptophan, there's no need for producing the enzymes used for tryptophan biosynthesis. Complete sense. Now, the problem here is to understand, to realize one of the things is if you consider that you have a very, very efficient Shide-Lugano sequence in front of the leader peptide, then you will have ribosomes sitting on the RNA all the time. And that will then result in anti-termination. Even though there's plenty of tryptophan, this system only works if you have a very a low translation efficiency, because you can only have one ribosome at the time of at the leader RNA. Otherwise, the system doesn't work. If you realize that, then you are in good shape. So that was the trip attenuation from E. coli. And as you hopefully realize, it's much more complicated than the pyrimidine attenuator from Lactobacillus lactis. I guess I think so. Okay, let's then move to another example of attenuation, and that is a special case systems that is called riboswitches. So riboswitches are RNA molecules that can bind a metabolite, but they are also leaders that can fold into mutually exclusive structures that either favors expression or prevents expression of the structural gene. And the metabolite stabilizes one of these structures. The thing is that riboswitches, they're not only dealing with termination, anti-termination that we saw before, attenuation, but it also can control translation. So let's look at these different possibilities. One way is that a riboswitch functions in termination, anti-termination. Here we have a structure that folds into an anti-terminator structure, because as you can see, we have a secondary structure, but we have you have no use right after the stem loop structure. If this can fold into a alternative structure here, where you form a terminator here, then you have termination. But this structure, the top one, that's the most stable one. But in order to stabilize the second one, you have a metabolite that binds to the RNA and stabilizes what is then will be the anti-terminator. So in this case, the metabolite stabilizes the anti-terminator, preventing the anti-terminator to form, favoring formation of the terminator structure. It can also go the other way around, so that the most stable structure by itself is a terminator structure. And here, if you then add a metabolite, it can then stabilize an anti-terminator structure that prevents formation of a terminator. Now, these metabolites, they are often the ones that is used, that is a product of the genes that produce, or the genes that encodes the proteins in a biosynthetic pathway. The reason why they are called riboswitches is because they were first found in genes encoded enzymes that were used in purine biosynthesis, in ribonucleotide biosynthesis. So that's why they were termed riboswitches. But today they also, this microphone. So it's not only ribonucleotides that can bind, but there are also examples of vitamins and other that exert this principle. Now, this was how riboswitches can control terminators and determinators. They can also control translation. Here we had an example with a leader peptide where you have a cytogano and a start codon accessible for the ribosome, so they can translate the RNA. Now, if you then add a metabolite, it can favor a structure in which the cytogano sequence and the start codon is sequestered into a secondary structure. Now, if you have a secondary structure here, then the ribosome cannot bind to the cytogano sequence, and that will prevent translation. So this is an example of translational control. Now, we can also work the other way around, so that normally the cytogano is sequestered in secondary structure, meaning there's no translation, but the addition of a metabolite will then expose the cytogano sequence for the ribosome. So let's go on. Now, the remaining part of the time, I'll discuss small RNAs and how they regulate gene expression. Until in the first half, we discussed how it was the messenger RNA itself that contained all the regulatory information. So in bacteria, the regulatory, the small RNAs are called sRNAs for small RNAs. What they do is that they regulate by base pairing with their targets. In this case, we have two different RNA molecules. The small RNA and the target RNA. There is what you could call a RNA chaperone that helps the interactions between the small RNA and its target, and that is the HFQ protein. So often these small RNAs function as antisense RNAs, or called antisense RNAs. For that simple reason is that they base pair directly with their targets. So in this case, we have what is called an cis-encoded antisense RNA. Now, these antisense RNAs are characterized by being transcribed from the opposite strand than its targets. So we have a promoter transcribing the opposite strand, and the promoter is then situated within the target gene. And in this case, of course, what we have here is a perfect match between the antisense RNA and its target, because they're using the same genetic material. We also experience what is called transencoded antisense RNAs. And as it says, but what it means is that the RNA is transcribed from another place on the chromosome. Now, these transencoded antisense RNAs are often imperfect in their match. The smart thing about these antisense RNAs that is transencoded is that they can have more targets than one. They can bind to several different targets. So how do they exert their action, these small RNAs, whether they are cis-encoded or transencoded? One way is to prevent translation. So if you produce a small RNA that is complementary to ribosome binding site, to a cytogano sequence, This will, of course, prevent the ribosome from binding to and initiating translation. Another, so that's also what is called Shanigano sequestering. This can also be in the opposite direction. So the binding of a small RNA exposes a Shanigano sequence. It could be that the messenger itself can form a secondary structure that sequesters the Shanigano sequence, and then if you have a secondary or a antisense RNA, you could then bind to the sequestering part, and in this way the Shanigano sequence is exposed to ribosome. So it can go in both ways. Another way that these small RNAs can work is by stabilization or destabilization of the messenger RNA. Bacteria have several ribonucleases that could be double-stranded. So one way is that they could actually degrade a messenger RNA. But again, it could also be the other way, so that the small RNA protects the messenger RNA from being degraded by a nuclease. So that's typically how these small RNAs work in bacteria. Either they prevent or regulate, or rather regulate translation, or they affect messenger RNA stability. Could you imagine that every RNA, you could just make a RNA, an antisense RNA, and then it will regulate transcription? The thing is, it's not as simple as that, because as we saw before, RNAs simply fold up into secondary structures, just like health. You do not have stretches of single-stranded RNA. They all form some sort of a secondary structure. So how does RNA structures, how do they become unzipped? And this is done by kissing. If you take one example, that is the copy number control of plasmid in E. coli, the R1 plasmid. It's controlled, the copy number is controlled by a small RNA, the CopA RNA. So here we have that we have a promoter that expresses an RNA, the RNA2, and that RNA encodes a Rep protein. So if the concentration of Rep A protein becomes high enough, then it would initiate transcription at the origin of replication. There's another promoter, the CopA promoter, that transcribes a antisense RNA, a cis antisense RNA. Now, the CopA antisense RNA binds to the messenger RNA, to the RNA2, and prevents it from being translated. And the initial contact between the two RNAs is what we call, is initiated by formation of a kissing complex. So now this is how it looks. So if you have the CopA RNA, it can fold up to a structure like this, and the messenger RNA, the messenger RNA continues out of the screen here, but a part of it that is complementary to the CopA can of course form a similar structure, because it's just the opposite strand. So they will form opposite strands. But when they do so, they cannot directly just base pair. The only way they can base pair is in the loop structures here, because they are complementary. So that is the only single-stranded DNA. So that's where you make the initial contact. So that's why it's called a kissing complex. So what happens now is that this hybrid between the two RNAs is extended, then some rearrangements occurs. You can see if you twist this around, it will look like something like this, and then you will move like a zipper, and becomes more and more and increases the duplex region, and finally you would end up by having a complete duplex structure like this. So the entire COP-A is bound to the messenger RNA. And this molecule is then translational inactive. So you can say that it is the more COP-A RNA you have, the less translation of Reb-A there will be. And here comes another. I'll not go into the details of how the regulation actually works in replication control. That will take a significant amount of time, so I think I will skip that here. Okay, so I mentioned that an important protein here was the HFQ protein, RNA chaperone, and it's needed for interactions between small RNAs and their targets, especially the ones where you have trans antisense RNAs. Now you can see that if you look at this is an electron micrograph of the protein, and it has this typical donut structure. It's actually it's two donuts on top of each other, and one part of the donut, the top part of the donut binds to the small RNA, whereas the bottom subunit of the donut binds to the target RNA, the binding is initiated by specific motifs. They're called ARN motifs, and that stands for adenosine, purine, and any nucleotide. So these three nucleotide binding motifs are recognized by the distal phase of the HFQ protein. And what they do is that this HFQ protein is that it brings the two RNAs very close to each other. That's their role, and in this way they can facilitate the binding. Typically, that will be done by establishing again on the target. You may have you have, of course, a complementary region, and again it starts with a kissing complex formation, and eventually they will make duplexes that don't have the biological function of preventing translation or stimulating translation, preventing degradation, stimulating degradation, whatever the mechanism is. So let's take the last part of this and devote that to the eukaryotic examples. I started out by saying that these small RNAs are widespread in the eukaryotic world. Indeed, they are. They are in general called microRNAs. Another thing you stumble into, that is RNA interference. That's a process where antisense RNAs that are derived from longer double-stranded RNAs can regulate transcription or the expression of genes. And again, the way that small RNAs work is by regulating translation or messenger RNA stability. Another type of RNAs, that's the small interfering RNAs, the siRNAs, or silencing RNAs. I mean, they do the same. They regulate primarily translation and stabilization of messenger RNA. But again, the nomenclature is a mess. So these microRNAs, how are they processed? Well, they're transcribed as pre-microRNAs. And they're then trimmed by an endonuclease or a group of endonucleases called Drosha, and they are then processed down to approximately 70 base pairs precursors. Now, the second nuclease is then, the group of nucleases is then into action, and that is the dicer that reduces the size of the RNA of the short RNA into, or the microRNA into its final size, and that is around 21 to 23 nucleotides. So that's actually quite specific. Now, these RNAs small RNAs are then recognized by a group of proteins called organelles that binds these proteins, and then they complex with another protein, the GW182 protein, and they are the active part in the biological action. So, and they will compare that to the role of HX2 proteins in prokaryotes. This is a protein that presents an small RNA to its target. This principle of maturation and binding to a protein is conserved for virtually all of these small RNAs. Because their targets are widespread, and they do it in numerous ways. What they do is that the RNA sequence is, of course, the one that determines the target. So this is done simply by formation a RNA hybrid with the target. And then several things can happen. These microRNAs, they target different processes in translation, especially in translation initiation. So just to remind you about translation initiation in eukaryotes, what happens here is that first you have formation of the 43S pre-initiation complex. Here you have that the small subunit of the ribosome is bound to initiation factor 2 and also the initiator tRNA, the methionine initiator tRNA. Now this pre-initiation complex then interacts with the cap binding complex. And the cap binding complex that consists of the messenger RNA. You have different initiation factors that is bound to the cap, but also the poly-A binding protein, because hopefully you remember that eukaryotic messengers has a poly-A chain and a cap on the 5' end. So this cap binding complex together with the 43S pre-initiation complex is merged to form the 43S complex. That then sits at the 5' end of the messenger RNA. Now, what happens then is that this complex then scans the messenger RNA until it reaches an AUG start codon. And here, the large subunit is joined, and so some initiation factors are expelled, and blah, blah, blah. We have a translation initiation. So there's a lot of different things that goes on in translation initiation. And all these things can be targeted of these microRNAs. So one of the ways that it works is that this target with the ARGO protein and the other one, they block translation elongation, and they simply do so by inducing a dissociation of the translating ribosome. So that, of course, will lead to an abrupt stop of translation. Sometimes this complex recruits a protease that simply degrades the protein that is being synthesized. Quite silly, but that's how it works. But anyway, the protein is not there anymore, so it's regulated. Sometimes the organic complex, the RISC complex, compete with binding to the cap, and this is the elongation factor, or initiation factor 4E that binds, that specifically recognizes the cap. And here we have competition between the Argonaut complex, the RISC complex, and this initiation factor. And that will, of course, if that is bound in high concentration, it will, of course, reduce translation initiation of the messenger. I don't know why we should see that. This we just discussed, so this was that must have been an insertion mutation here. Another way that that this RISC complex can work is by preventing the big subunit in the assembly at the start codon. So we have a small subunit and the initiation complex sitting at the start codon, but the access of the large subunit ribosome is blocked by the Argonaut protein. Sometimes what also going to happen is that the RISC complex prevents this loop formation where you have that the poly-A binding protein actually makes contact to the poly-A tail and then prevents translation or assembly at the cap. Or it could be that it somehow recruits a poly-A hydrolase, so the poly-A tail is degraded. That would, of course, prevent translation initiation. Also, it could the Argonaut complex, the RISC complex, can recruit a decapping protein that removes the cap from the 5' end of the messenger, and that would efficiently prevent translation. And also, again, that could be in combination with depoadenylation of the 3' tail. So all in all these different effects will, of course, prevent translation. Okay. So another general way of of regulating gene expression by small RNAs is by double-stranded RNA. If you have a double-stranded RNA larger than 26 nucleotides, if that's present in the cell, it will recruit this protein, RNA-dependent protein kinase. So what it does is that it phosphorylates the initiation factor 2A, and when that is happening, then the initiation factor 2A is inactive, so it cannot be involved in protein synthesis, and that is a general effect. I mean, that will affect all genes in the cell, all messengers in the cell will be affected by this. So it will simply prevent or reduce translation in general. Now, these large RNAs, double-stranded RNAs, they are often associated with infection by viruses, RNA viruses. For instance, if one of you have corona, your cells will try to knock it down by this mechanism. But viruses are smart, so they can circumvent this system. But it is one way of a general defense against double-stranded RNA viruses. So that is, of course, a general effect. Another effect is that a double-stranded RNase also induces an enzyme that makes 2,5 A's. That means AMPs that is elongated as a small chains, and the presence of such a molecule will activate the RNase L. And this is a general RNase that degrades all messengers. So it's so the effect is the same as with the RNA directed kinase, namely to prevent translation in general. Finally, these silencing RNAs may be complementary to messenger RNAs, and will then, if they are reduced in size, for instance by dicer, they will then be able to bind to the messenger, and in this way they will make messenger RNA being degraded. So this is all these mechanisms. They are they are general. They affect the general gene expression in a cell. So you can say it's a way of shutting down a cell. And of course that makes sense. If the cell is subject to a viral infection, close it down. Now these RNAs that we discussed, both the RNA silencing and the microRNAs, they work by primarily interfering with translation of a messenger. There are also RNAs that works on another level, and that is heterochromatin formation. The heterochromatin, as you may remember, is the part of the chromatin or the DNA or the chromosome that is highly dense, packed into histones and then preventing expression of this area of the chromosome. So you can say in this way, these microRNAs work by controlling chromatin remodeling. Now, the formation of heterochromatin is associated with histone methylation. Histone can be methylated as specific residues, and some of them are then inducing heterochromatin formation. Now, what has been observed is that despite the fact that some of this heterochromatin is densely packed, there are regions that are transcribed. And so what you have here is a part of, so you have small areas on this heterochromatin that sort of loops out and is then subject to DNA or RNA polymerase II that then produces RNA from that. Now, what you find in cells is also RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So it's not the normal way that that the genetic code goes. So this is unusual, but it's there also in normal cells. But these RNA-dependent RNA polymerases, they are mainly known from viruses, and especially from coronavirus. They have this coronavirus are RNA viruses that is dependent on the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. Next time we can hopefully discuss more about how these coronaviruses work. Now, these are the RNA-dependent RNA polymerases can then produce the opposite strands from what were produced by the polymerase II, the normal transcription. So in this way, the double-stranded RNA is produced within the cell. Now, this double-stranded RNA is then trimmed by the dicer enzyme, and it produces the silencing, the small interfering RNAs. They're then loaded into these protein complexes that includes some protein factors, but also this organoid protein that we discussed previously. In the previous one, we discussed how it was associated with GW1A2 protein, but here it is some other protein factors. But in principle, it's the same. It is a protein that exposes an RNA molecule. And this complex can then bind to messenger RNAs. And when they do so, they recruit methylases, histone methylases, that then put methyl groups of the histidine or the histones in the RNA. When they do so, but when they do that, then they initiate the formation of heterochromatin. It also induces more transcription by RNA polymerase II, but then again, that will then again produce more double-stranded RNA, more silencer RNA. So this is kind of feed-forward induction. So it's it's really is a very efficient way to amplify the signal. So you get a heavy methylation of the histones in that region. So finally, the other proteins involved in heterochromatin formation, for instance, this SVI6 that we discussed last time, will then further stimulate heterochromatin formation, and will have an efficient shutdown And moreover, this also stabilizes this heterochromatin formation. So you can see this is an example of an epigenetic switch. So it serves as keeping this part of the DNA packed into heterochromatin.